Okay, so good morning, class. So I'm going to help you break down the free response question on the opioid crisis right now. I hope you can see it on the screen here. So you're pretending to be a junior advisor to the President of the United States, and reports of moms, dads, people just generally suffering from the opioid addiction have disturbed the President. And so you're tasked, I'm not going to read the whole thing, you're tasked with coming up with a rough draft of policy proposals to be introduced to a bipartisan group of legislators coming to the White House next week. And as you're drafting the proposals, you're freaking out because there's so many different effects that you have to consider, right? And there's just too much. And so you get an idea, you make a phone call to Mr. Diaz, your old AP microeconomics teacher, and you are certain that he's going to help you think about the trade-offs inherent in every decision. So in your phone call, Mr. Diaz tells you that he's not going to give you the right solution to the opioid epidemic, but he's just going to help frame and center your thinking about this problem so you can come up with solutions and proposals that you think will work. Okay? And so the first thing Mr. Diaz asks you to do is he asks you to show graphically how supply-side policy proposals may prove less effective than demand-side solutions given the inelastic demand of opioids. And so one way that we can do this, and I have an Instagram video on this, is we can show two markets. The market for this regular over-the-counter pain relief, Tylenol. Not get in the way. And the market for, oops. For opioids. You could put opioids, we could generally be talking, we can like break down this market further and talk about pharmaceutical opioids or illegal opioids, or we can break it down into even further parts. We can talk about the market for heroin, the market for fentanyl, the market for Oxycontin, all that good stuff. But let's just use general opioids for now. And so all I'm asking you is really simply to show graphically how a supply-side policy proposal may prove less effective than demand-side solutions given the inelastic demand of opioids. So you can draw a market for anything here. And I've said before, we shouldn't be conceptualizing inelastic or elastic demand as steepness of the demand curve, because there are, at different points along a demand curve, there's variation in terms of elasticity. At different points along the demand curve itself. And units do very much matter in determining whether we are seeing movements and changes that reflect inelastic or elastic demand, right? But we've talked about inelastic demand for a while now, and we said that we would expect the market for opioids to be characterized by inelastic demand. Who wants to come off mute and explain why the market for opioids would be characterized as more inelastic demand than a market for Tylenol? Or the hand raising. Why would the market for opioids be characterized as more inelastic demand than the market for Tylenol? Come on, my friends, I know we know it. Why would the market for opioids be characterized by more inelastic demand than the market for Tylenol?
More inelastic?
Mm-hmm. Remember, inelastic means that we exert a lot of force, so like, significant changes in price, then quantity demanded doesn't seem to budge. So why would opioid?
It's an addiction.
Yes.
It's an addiction. I'll answer.
Ileana said it perfectly. She said it's because we expect that there's the addiction factor, right? The market for opioids is characterized by the addiction factor. And so people are less sensitive to changes in price. And remember, we said that inelastic demand reflects or manifests itself in which the percent change in quantity demanded is smaller than the percent change in price. People are less sensitive to changes in price with inelastic or markets characterized by inelastic demand. Okay, and so it says come up with a supply side proposal and think about how a supply side proposal may prove less effective than demand side solutions given the inelastic demand of opioids, right? And so specifically, when you're thinking of supply side proposals remember we want to limit the equilibrium quantity or move the equilibrium quantity as far as possible to the left in the market for opioids or the market for opioid abuse or maybe illicit opioid markets and whatnot. So a supply side solution would have to be a leftward shift. That's the only way to shift the equilibrium quantity point, right? So here's supply 2. And we could show here in the market for Tylenol, and again, we're assuming similar units, a leftward shift of the supply curve. And we could see the equilibrium quantity in the market for Tylenol falls, a decent amount. We don't know whether this is elastic or unit elastic because we don't have units. So we're just kind of using relative and vague terms. And it seems like the equilibrium quantity in the opioid market doesn't fall as much as the equilibrium quantity in the Tylenol market. And again, we're assuming similar units and stuff like that. To actually determine whether this reflects inelastic or elastic demand, we would actually need units, and then we would need to calculate it. But graphically, this is what I would want to see in question number 1. Okay. For question number 2, it says assume increases in the amount of money spent in illicit markets increases violent crime. Oh, I shouldn't have erased this. But it says assume increases in the amount of money spent in illicit markets increases violent crime. Explain why a supply-side solution to lowering market equilibrium quantity of heroin may have the unintended effect of increasing violent crimes. Well, first I want to start by saying that the relationship between illegality and violence is actually a bit more complicated. I'll include this article about the relationship between illegality and violence that I think is very convincing. It's by Richard Snyder and Angelica Duran Martinez in the link in the description of the YouTube video. But for now, let's just assume that this is correct, that the more money spent in illicit markets, the more violent crime you have. And so we want to think about why a supply-side solution may have the unintended effect of increasing violent crime. Okay, so why a supply-side solution, again, a solution to the opioid epidemic that shifts the curve to the left, the supply curve to the left, why might it have the unintended effect of increasing violent crime? Well, first off, I need the formula for total revenue. So who remembers the formula for total revenue? Total revenue equals price times what? Who remembers the formula? Price times. Yes, excellent. Who was that?
Jennifer.
Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, excellent. Total revenue is price times quantity. And so in a market characterized by more inelastic demand, a supply side solution, and we can imagine a supply side solution would be something along maybe increasing drug interdiction efforts, right? Increasing law enforcement capacities. If we assume that this is correct, that increases in the amount of money spent in illicit markets would actually increase the total revenue, in these illicit markets, because in theory, the drug dealers and that remained in the market would be selling that good at a higher price point. It would actually increase the total revenue in the market, and we would actually expect an effect where, if this were true, increases in the amount of money spent in the illicit market increases violent crimes. We would expect an increase in violent crimes. Now, the relationship between illegality and violence is a bit more complicated, but there are some people that think that this is true, right? And so you would explain that idea by talking about how with markets characterized by inelastic demand, or goods that are more inelastic, raising the price of those goods, although it will lead to a drop-off in quantity demanded of those goods, as we can see here, would still increase total revenue. Remember, we did the Martin Shkreli example in class where he raised the price of an AIDS drug by 5,000%. Right? So you would want to explain it. And then question 3, here it says, use the concept of cross-price elasticity of demand to explain how an increase in the price of pharmaceutical opioids would affect the market for heroin. When you're doing this FRQ, I don't want you to think that you have to find numbers or do calculations. I really am just trying to push you to think about the value of these formulas that I've been giving you, right? I don't care that you can memorize things. I mean, yeah, it's probably going to be much better for me if you can memorize things in terms of the AP test and in terms of how I'm viewed as a teacher, but I care that you actually understand the value of these concepts. And so it says, use the concept of cross-price elasticity of demand to explain how an increase in the price of pharmaceutical opioids would affect the market for heroin. Well, we've already talked about this in class, and we've talked about it at length, that here I'm going to put the market for Oxycontin, and then here I'm going to put the market for heroin. You don't have to draw graphs on your FRQ, but I'm just doing that so we can see what I'm trying to get at with this question. But we had said before in class that one of the reasons why the demand curve is downward sloping, one of the mechanisms is the substitution effect. And as the price of a good increases, you're going to start going to find substitutes for that good. So here we can see, as the price goes up, you're going to start looking for substitutes for that good. So we can imagine a situation in which the price of Oxycontin goes up. We would start looking for substitutes for that good. And unfortunately, we found out that in the opioid epidemic, people who oftentimes become addicted to pharmaceutically prescribed opioids and abuse those will enter the heroin market because the price of heroin is a lot cheaper than Oxycontin. And we would expect a situation that if we were to have a demand curve and a supply curve, if the price of Oxycontin were to go up, we would expect the demand curve for heroin in the heroin market to shift to the right. And we would think of this as an increase in the quantity demanded, right? Because we can see that the new equilibrium quantity is greater, Q2, an increase in the quantity demanded of heroin, and of course the quantity is supplied of heroin. Right, that's what's so interesting about the opioid epidemic is the extent to which it links legal pharmaceutical markets with illegal markets. And then, of course, the transnational aspect of supply chains and all that or supply chains and all that. And so, but I say use the formula of cross-price elasticity of demand to explain this, right? And so you could say the formula for cross-price elasticity of demand is the percent change in QD of good X over the percent change in price of Y. Well, we can imagine a situation in which the percent change is positive for OxyContin, right? We can imagine a situation in which the percent change is positive for OxyContin. Alyssa, can you see this on the screen? You check? Okay. Like this too, the plus? Yeah. The percent change is positive for OxyContin, but the percent change, and the percent change in price of Y is also, or wait, what? I'm sorry. The percent change in the price of Y, so we'll say that OxyContin is good Y is positive, and that this would also lead to a positive percent change in the quantity demanded of the other good, which we can see. Or we can see in this market that a positive percent change in the market for OxyContin leads to a positive percent change in the market for heroin, or a positive percent change in the quantity demanded of heroin, of good X. And so we know, remember we said that we don't necessarily care about the statistic that we get from this formula, we care about the sign. And a positive sign, a positive divided by a positive is a positive. A positive sign, we said, indicates that the goods are substitutes. And so what I want you to do when you answer this question, to use the concept of cross-price elasticity of demand to explain how an increase in the price of pharmaceutical opioids would affect the market for heroin, I want you to say that an increase in the percent change in the price of OxyContin will lead to an increase in the quantity demanded of heroin because these goods are substitutes, and we expect, or something along the lines of, you expect goods that are substitutes, or with this formula, we know that there's a positive relationship between the price of one good that is a substitute and the quantity demanded of the other good that's a substitute. There's so many different ways that you could say it. Okay? Then for 4, it says use the concept of income elasticity of demand to explain how you expect a fall of an opioid abuser's income to impact their decision to abuse pharmaceutical opioids or illicit opioids. So real quick, CFU, who can tell me what's the difference between a normal good and an inferior good? Go ahead and just come off mic. What's the difference between a normal good and an inferior good? Normal versus inferior. Normal versus inferior. The percent change. If your income goes up, are you going to consume a normal good or an inferior good?
Oh, if the income goes up, normal?
Alyssa's saying normal, and she's right. If your income goes up, you're going to consume a normal good. If you get an extra or you get more money in your paycheck, you're going to start going out to fancier restaurants instead of eating Burger King, because that's like an inferior good. And so what income elasticity of demand allows us to see is it allows us to determine which goods are normal and which goods are inferior. Right? And again, I don't want you to do a calculation. I just want you to think about what this elasticity is showing us. That's the point of this FRQ. And it says, use the concept of income elasticity of demand to explain how you expect a fall of an opioid abuser's income to impact their decision to abuse pharmaceutical opioids or illicit opioids. And so if we're expecting a fall in income, then we know that that person is going to be consuming an inferior good. And we have to make an educated guess, right? Of course, with policymaking, and policymaking informed by social science, which I think is the best type of policymaking, you have to go into like fact-finding missions. But for right now, let's make a hypothesis. And the hypothesis I think a lot of us would want to make is that pharmaceutical opioids are probably normal goods. I don't know if that's true. And illegal opioids like heroin and fentanyl are probably inferior goods. Whereas your income goes down, you might want to be consuming more heroin. I don't know if this is true, but let's just make an educated guess and a hypothesis, right? Because we're just coming up with policy proposals, and maybe we need to set up a fact-finding mission. And so using the income elasticity of demand formula to help us explain our thinking behind this, to help us explain our expectation of what an opioid abuser might do if their income were to go down, we would say that as the percent change in, as the income of someone goes up, we expect the quantity demanded of normal goods to increase because we think that pharmaceutical opioids are normal goods and illegal opioids such as heroin and fentanyl are inferior goods, that the quantity demanded of illegal opioids, or the percent change in the quantity demanded of illegal opioids will be positive when the percent change in income goes down. And we know this calculation, right? Because remember we said we were concerned about the sign too, right? If it's a positive sign, so after you divide out percent change in QD over percent change in income, we said if we get a positive sign, we're describing it as a normal good, and a negative sign, we're describing it as an inferior good. Okay? Then finally, 5, after all of that, I want you to show graphically what your policy proposals are. And I want 2. And then I want you to say that you considered all these elasticities. Right? So you can come up with whatever policy proposals you want, but show graphically what they're going to do to a market. You can focus your policy proposals on the market for heroin if you want. Doesn't matter. But show graphically your policy proposals. You want to increase law enforcement capacity to go after drug dealers, and then you would expect a leftward shift in supply. Public education campaign, you would expect a leftward shift in demand, right? And you would expect, hopefully, your policy proposals lead to an area in which the equilibrium quantity keeps moving left in this market. But we also have to consider how this will have an effect on other markets, maybe the market for pharmaceutical opioids and stuff like that. So I just want to see that you put some thought into your policy proposals. The price may be ambiguous because we don't know what the price would be given a supply shift and a demand shift. But we want to keep moving the equilibrium quantity in these markets to the left. And then the last question is, what ideological resistance, either from Democrats or Republicans or both, do you anticipate, and why? This is just a fun one. Don't trash Republicans, don't trash Democrats, or you can if you want. Maybe you can have an argument about what you think is the best policies. Make sure your argument is informed by social science, right? That's what's important. That's why we use economics for. All right, thank you guys. Whew, that was a long video. How long was that?